Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm the GCSE science teacher, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the nervous system for the homeostasis module that is part of paper 2 content for GCSE Biology. So if you do find the video helpful, feel free to give it a big thumbs up so I know, and also do feel free to share this with anyone else you think would benefit from learning more. You can also subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss any uploads from me. I do teach biology, but I also teach physics and chemistry, where I have also made lots of videos on those topics too. So feel free to check those out. I'll link some as well at the end for you. With no further ado, let's get into it. So as a bit of an overall overview of the nervous system, you need to be aware that the nervous system, like any system in our body, is made up of organs that all kind of communicate and work together to do a specific function. Remember, organs are made up of tissues, and tissues are a group of cells that essentially work together to do a certain job or a function. And the nervous system's main overarching role is to coordinate the body. It helps us to think, it helps us to move, it helps us to decide whether something's a threat or not. And it also helps us, as we've evolved over time, to critically think. This is very different to other organisms, other animals even, that actually don't have that critical thinking or even that ability to respond to the environment the way we do. And even actually the non-conscious parts of our brain and the bits of our brain that actually help us to understand that we are who we are and we can actually acknowledge ourselves. So our nervous system, compared to other living organisms, is very advanced, and it's an incredibly important part of our system as well. So it's made up of two parts. It's made up of the central nervous system, or the CNS, such as the brain and also the spinal cord. Now, remember, the spinal cord is the nerves or the neurons that are actually found within the spine. Remember, the spine is made up of bones and cartilage, and its main job is to protect our spinal cord. The spinal cord itself is connected to the brain, and it helps to kind of communicate with the rest of the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, which is the outside of that central nervous system. So this includes things like the neurons, this includes things like receptors, and also effectors. And we're going to talk about each of those in a bit more detail. But also, you need to be aware of three specific types of neurons. These are cells that help coordinate that response. So we have the sensory neuron, the relay neuron, and the motor neuron. Now, the word neuron can actually be spelt in two different ways. You could have it with an E on the end or with an N on the end. It doesn't really matter too much which you choose. It's just an American versus English way of spelling. So if you see it in either way, don't worry too much. It's talking about the same thing. The one thing you should be aware of, though, nerve tissue is made up of neurons. Okay, neurons are the cell itself, and we're going to talk about those different structures that make up that cell, because it is a specialized cell, and you should know some of those key ideas as well later on in the video. Interestingly enough, our nervous system, if it is damaged, we can't really do much about that. It can lead to problems with functionality in our body, such as paralysis. But we are able, as scientists, to use something called a stem cell to actually treat paralysis. So if someone has an injury, maybe they get into an accident and they can't move the parts of their body, maybe their lower body, we can actually treat this paralysis by giving that person stem cells that can actually replace and create new nervous tissue. And this is kind of a pioneering bit of research, a bit of biology, and I'll link some information about it in the description box below, as always, if you'd like further reading. But this is something specifically that you should know for the exam, that stem cells can be used to treat paralysis. And stem cells are essentially cells that have undifferentiated. They are not necessarily already having a function. They actually have no function as it stands. They have the ability to differentiate, and this can be utilized all the time in our bodies. So we find stem cells in the bone marrow, and often these stem cells can go on to create lots of red blood cells. We also find stem cells in embryos, and these can be used to create all the different cells we have in our body as that embryo develops into a fetus. But we can also artificially use stem cells in the case of paralysis to actually treat diseases. And this is something that scientists are really excited about, because By having these stem cells from a certain person, say the patient, we can actually match it with their DNA. So we can create parts of the body, potentially even organs, that we could use as opposed to transplanting organs, which have lots of risks associated with them. Obviously, it's major surgery, so there's a risk of infection. But one of the other risks is the fact that you could transplant an organ into somebody and it might get rejected. So that person would need to take immunocompromising drugs consistently to make sure that their immune system doesn't essentially attack that foreign organ, because the body recognizes it as something that's not part of that person, as it's come from someone else. So these are all different things that are currently going on in medical research that is very exciting and is consistently changing and evolving as we do. And as more technology comes out, we can actually utilize this to help people get better. So it's pretty cool, to be honest. So let's have a look at the structure of neurons then. This is a typical type of neuron. Like I said, there's three. You've got a relay neuron, you've got a motor neuron, and you've got a sensory neuron. But for the most part, they all have very similar structures, but slightly different functions. And we'll come on to that in a moment. But it's really important that you know that neurons are vast. There are loads of different types, not just those three. Also, though, they are kind of like a network. So if you were to take a snapshot in the body, and you can see those images there, these are kind of artist's impressions, you can see that it's a real tangled web that is woven all around the body. It looks quite complicated and it looks quite messy. And that's kind of because it is, because there's lots of different pathways that are information needs to go through to communicate and coordinate our body. Remember, sometimes we're just sitting in a room or we're running, and we need to kind of be able to look at the world around us and coordinate our own response quickly and effectively. And it's done through this network of different cells communicating together. There's a definite intelligence there that we have in our body, which is pretty cool. A lot of the time, students will not understand that this is a mixture of cells working together. And in fact, sometimes some students will think from the tip of our fingers, we'll have one long neuron going all the way up to our arm and to our brain. And we need to remember that this is not the case. Neurons are very, very tiny. They're microscopic sometimes in the case as their cells. But because there's so many of them working together, this is actually a good thing. It's beneficial, because if one of them gets damaged, there may be an alternative path that can be used to help with that communication or help with that coordination, as opposed to if there was one long neuron that went all the way from the tip of our fingers to our brain. If that got damaged, well, we wouldn't have a route to use anymore. So although the nervous system is very vast, it's actually a good thing because it allows us to communicate and control our body the way we need to. So let's have a look at the structures then. We've got a typical cell here. So we have things that have been found in other cells. So the nucleus, it's an animal cell. That means it's eukaryotic as well, meaning that the DNA is found within that nucleus to help control that cell. And the cell body itself is sometimes referred to as a soma, and it will depend on what exam board you use that will tell you if you need to know that. Because it's a cell, it contains a cytoplasm, just like any other cell. This is where reactions can happen, things like respiration. And also we have the cell membrane as well that allows substances to move in and out, just like diffusion, active transport, and also osmosis as well. At A level, you need to know a little bit more about this in terms of the different ions that can pass through and all that kind of thing. But for GCSE, you just need to know there's a cell membrane there. On the side of the neuron that has the cytoplasm, you can see that it actually has these small little projections that kind of look like branches, and we call these dendrons or dendrites if we want to talk about all of them. And these essentially help connect other neurons to them and actually help pass on that message. The message transfers through and down the axon, which is a long structure that essentially helps that information pass along to the end of the neuron, which is called the axon terminal. And again, this is where that information is passed on to another neuron. So it's constantly passing that message on. Now, the axon is actually insulated with something called myelin. And this is a type of material, it's specifically made of something called a Schwann cell. It's named after the scientist who discovered it. And essentially, because it's insulated, it means that although there may be lots and lots of neurons crossing over one another, they're allowed to do that because they're still insulated. So that information gets passed along the axon without disrupting other neurons that are around it. It's kind of like insulation of a wire. That plastic that insulates a wire allows that conduction of electricity without it kind of getting tangled up with any other wires that may be near it. It's the same kind of idea here. We also have structures called nodes of Ranvier. And again, this will depend on the exam board that you're studying for, whether you need to know this. But the nodes of Ranvier are small gaps between the myelin, and this helps to increase the pace at which this information is passed on. Remember, the nervous system is an incredibly fast system, much, much faster than, say, the endocrine system, which uses the blood to transport hormones to target tissues. That takes a long time. The nervous system takes seconds, milliseconds even, to transport information. So the nodes of Ranvier kind of help that process quicken and increase the rate at which that is done. So let's have a look at how these neurons talk to each other or communicate to each other. And we need to know this idea in the term of reflex arc or reflex action. So a reflex action is when there is a stimulus or a change in the environment and it causes a response from the person. So for example, we might be in a very dark room, maybe we're at the cinema, and our eyes will adjust to the cinema lighting. So it's very dark in there, you've got a big screen, and your pupils will actually dilate to allow that light to go through because it's very dark, so you can see better. Now, when you come out of the cinema, often you feel like, ooh, it's very bright outside, and that's because your eyes are starting to adjust to that change in the environment, the stimulus. So the stimulus is the light, and our eyes have receptors that respond to it and tell our body to kind of constrict or enclose our eyes, maybe to stop the light shining too much, but also it helps our eyes adjust and allows our pupils to constrict as well and no longer dilate. So we have less light coming in, so we can actually adjust to that new change. Like I said, reflex action, this is something that happens fast and it's automatic, and it doesn't include parts of the brain which are responsible for conscious thought. If there is a change to the environment that's particularly dangerous or hazardous, our body needs to respond very quickly. And this has happened through evolution because essentially it keeps us living. It helps us to survive. So reflex action is super important. Now, the reflex arc is a sequence of events that happen during our nervous system to help us respond to that change in the environment, specifically if it's a very dangerous stimulus. This example here I'm going to show you, someone has stood on some Lego and they didn't know that the Lego was there. So their initial response would be to be like, ooh, that really hurt. And there is a sequence of events that take you from standing on the Lego to moving your foot away, because you'll probably move your foot away very quickly without even realizing. I was straightening my hair the other day, and if you have a straightener or you've straightened your hair before, you'll know if you accidentally touch it, your hand, you move it straight away because it's very hot. So it's the same kind of idea in this case. So what happens? We have the stimulus, which is the sharp object we've just stood on, and it triggers a response by having the stimulus triggering the receptor. Our skin cells have lots of receptors on them and they're sensitive to any changes. So that receptor picks up this information and it shares that information with the sensory neuron. Now, the sensory neuron, it senses this information. Remember our 5 senses. We've got smell, sight, taste, touch, and also hearing. So the sense that we're talking about in this example is touch. We felt a response. We felt a stimulus. That sensory neuron passes that information through electrical impulses to another neuron called the relay neuron. And the relay neuron essentially acts as a gateway from one neuron to another, and it passes this information on to the motor neuron. Now notice the relay neuron, I've got a picture of the spine here, because actually the relay neuron is actually embedded within the spinal cord. Notice that the spinal cord, remember, is part of the central nervous system, but at no point does this go to the conscious part of the brain. We have to respond quickly. So we haven't got time to think, oh, was that sharp or not? Or, oh, was that hot or not? We know instantly that that could be dangerous, so we move straight away. So the relay neuron passes this information again through electrical impulses to the motor neuron. And you'll see that the motor neuron actually is connected to something called an effector. Now, an effector could be any kind of cell that helps the body respond quickly. So usually, and especially at GCSE, you need to know that effectors include muscles or even the liver. But they can really be any kind of cell that trigger a response. But in this case, it's the muscles, because in our leg, our muscles will contract and this will cause the response for us to move our foot away. So in the exam, they could ask you to describe the action of reflex action or reflex arcs, and these are the same steps that happen each time, just with different situations. Especially if you're doing triple science, you will always be expected to apply your knowledge to unfamiliar situations, but the same knowledge applies, so you can still use this idea moving forward. So, what actually happens between two neurons? How does the sensory neuron talk to the relay neuron? And how does the relay neuron talk to the motor neuron? Well, what actually happens is a sequence of events that occur at the gap between those neurons. And the gap is called the synapse. Now, the synapse we know has lots of different things going on there. But for GCSE, there's a couple of key ideas that you must be aware of. So, the information gets transferred or transported across the axon, and it gets to the end of the axon terminal. And that electrical impulse essentially triggers a release of a certain set of chemicals called neurotransmitters. Now, there's loads of different types of neurotransmitters. Some include acetylcholine, we've got dopamine, there's loads of different ones. And again, I'll leave some information in the description box below if you're interested. If any of you are doing GCSE psychology, you may actually know a few more. So if you are in that boat, in that situation, do comment down below and let me know. It's always great to share extra knowledge. But yeah, those neurotransmitters, those chemicals, are essentially those little circles, those green circles you see. These are called vesicles. They essentially are membrane-bound structures inside the cell that hold on to chemicals. Those little neurotransmitters, those little purple circles you see that are in those vesicles, they essentially get released into the synapse. They fuse with the cell membrane, that axon terminal. This is called the synaptic bulb, by the way, on neuron 1. And because they fuse with the membrane, they are released into the gap between those two neurons, the synapse, and they diffuse through the synapse. So just a bit of a recap, diffusion is the movement of substances from a high to low concentration down a concentration gradient and across the membrane. And this is what's exactly happening in this case. So those neurotransmitters are transferred through diffusion and attached to receptors that are on the synaptic cleft or on the second neuron. Those receptors, like anything in biology, are specific and complementary in shape to those certain neurotransmitters. Because there's lots of different types of neurotransmitters, that means there's lots of different types of receptors. And essentially, you want the body to respond correctly at an appropriate time. Actually, sometimes there are some problems with the receiving of this information, or there may be too much binding. And again, this can actually lead to some health conditions. Again, I'll leave some information for you below. But once those neurotransmitters have bound with the receptor, they will trigger the stimulus again. They will trigger that electrical impulse along the second axon. And this continues and continues and continues. So that signal is passed on until it gets to the relevant place. So it is a mixture of chemical, but also electrical impulses that are going on in the neurons as well. And that's it from me today. A bit of an overview for you of the different parts of the nervous system. Essentially, this is all the key ideas you need to know. We will talk about glucoregulation and thermoregulation and some osmoregulation in a few future videos. So if you are interested in all of those, let me know in the comments or give this video a thumbs up so I can make those for you. If you did enjoy the video, like I said, please do feel free to share this and do subscribe if you haven't already. I've been the GCSE science teacher and you have been curious. I will catch you in the next one. In the meantime, if you want more revision from me, check out the videos I've linked. There's biology, chemistry, or physics on my channel. I've also got an Instagram and TikTok. All of it is at the GCSE Science Teacher. Thank you so much for your support, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye.